for Chapter 2. Narrow Escape. Within minutes, Heather and Casey slid down and through a broken section of the foundation wall. Heather's light focused on the break in the foundation. The rocks in this section looked different than the rest of the wall. It may have been an entrance at one time, but it looks like it was quickly filled in for some reason. Yeah, and badly done, said Casey. Must have been in a hurry to cover it up. Probably the same reason for the rush job on the altar. You two can debate things later, said James. Right now, you gotta come see this. He led them along a short passage where the walls were close enough that outstretched arms easily touched them. A half-dozen paces later, they entered a square chamber the size of a large bedroom. A blanket of dust covered the remnants of a once colorful murals on the walls to the left and in front of them. Small chunks of stone were discarded on the floor, torn from the walls as a testament to ancient vandals and robbers who had been there first to loot. Among the murals were star clusters and constellations. Another passage was centered on the right wall, but flashlights quickly revealed its abrupt end in a pile of rubble. The walls of the room were made of upper and lower stone sections. The lower panels were about 3 feet wide and 7 feet tall, with 5 panels per wall, except at the 2 walls with passages, where 2 stone panels were on either side of the openings. Ancient cement filled the minuscule joints between stones. Spanning across the lower wall sections was a 3-foot-high stone cap, which stretched the length of each wall. Primitive tool marks marred the walls. Looks like someone was trying to find something, said Casey. James nodded as his light skimmed across the damaged wall. Or hide something. A blinding light instantly flashed the room. Casey jumped. Sorry, said Heather sheepishly as she lowered her camera and rubbed her spotted vision. I forgot the flash was on. James squeezed his eyes shut a few times. A warning would have been nice. Casey stepped towards the opposite wall and swept his light across it. Amidst the severely chipped wall and tool scars were the remnants of a fragmented and faded jungle scene. Above the trees, right of center at head level, was a star with streaks that shot out in diagonal rays into the top right corner, giving the impression of a shooting star. Hiding in the trees below the star was a chipped, deformed jaguar, its face disproportionately larger than the body. The jungle cat's eyes stared menacingly at those in the room. Small pieces were missing from its gaping mouth, and something reflected the light as it passed over the maw. Approaching the mural, Casey pointed his light into the jaguar's mouth. Inside was a small vertical slot, barely a half-inch wide, its sides slightly chipped as if something had tried to pry at it. A vertical strip of yellow light reflected from inside the slot. Inside wondering what Casey had found, James and Heather followed him across the room. Heather bent slightly to peer into the mouth. How'd you see that? I think it was the flash that reflected off it, but something about this section of wall seems different. It doesn't look as damaged, almost like the same tools couldn't do much to this wall. Casey pulled out the knife on his multi-tool and started poking in the slot. The knife tip was barely long enough to clip the edge of the object. A minute later, a gold, coin-shaped object rolled out, and Casey caught it. He turned it over in his fingers. On one side was some runic lettering, and a shooting star was engraved on the other. I think you hit the jackpot, said James. It might actually be gold, said Casey. Definitely has a little weight to it. Casey's attention returned to the painting remnants. In the center of the star was another slot, camouflaged among the dark flecks and chips. He shone his light inside and poked around with his knife. Then he stopped and cocked his head at James. What was it you said the tribal elder told you about finding the twin star? James thought for a moment. His instructions were the fallen star and the bridge of light need 2 stars. Take the star to the star in the moon. Place the star and shine its light. The second star is beyond Ekbalam. My English translation doesn't sound as good. James' eyes lit up. Wait, Ekbalam is a black jaguar. Do you think this is it? Casey nodded. The star in the star. Do you think the crystal is the star he was talking about? James pulled the crystal disc out, released it from its protection, and flipped it over between his finger and thumb. Maybe. What do you think we need to do with it? Casey pointed to the slot in the star. We're in the moon temple. Put the star in the star. James stepped to the wall, peered into the star in the mural. He hesitantly turned the crystal over in his right hand. I don't know. I'd hate to lose this. Okay, said Casey. Then let's go back and let the professor know. James's eyes narrowed at his brother. He pinched the small disc and placed it into the slot. It slid back beyond his reach, and nothing happened. All right, you two, said Heather, shaking her head. You're going to have to come clean about what James was told and what you guys know. But first, were you told what was supposed to happen? James shrugged. He pointed his flashlight into the slot to see if he could retrieve his crystal. The light splintered into the crystal, and for an instant the slot was brightly lit with reflected light. The wall reverberated with muffled growl. Heather's brow rose in concern. I hope you didn't set off a booby trap. I'd hate to try to run out of here with a big boulder chasing after us, or a spiked ceiling crushing down. No, said James, his eyes moving to the scene. I think we're safe where spiked ceilings are concerned. And boulders rolling down doesn't seem seems unlikely as well, added Casey. They stared at the wall. Nothing changed. No movement, no sound. You guys are freaking me out, said Heather. Casey leaned forward and pressed his ear to the wall. He didn't hear anything, but it felt different. When he pushed back from the wall, he felt a little give, almost imperceptibly. I think it's a door. Help me push. Are you serious? Asked Heather. The walls look solid. Whoever hacked at it didn't budge it. Even if these rock sections weren't part of a wall holding up a pyramid above us, they'd probably weigh a ton or more. James shrugged and joined Casey against the wall. Heather resigned herself and helped push. For a moment, nothing happened. Then crackling, like the soft crunch of freshly fallen leaves, resounded in the half-dark. Vertical cracks sprinted up and ripped around the center of the wall, outlining the jaguar and star section. Pieces of ancient cement broke, and the joints tore open from the floor, up to about 7 feet on both sides of the 3-foot wall section. A horizontal seam exposed itself and joined the tops of the 2 vertical ones. The right side, where James was pushing, moved inwards 1/4 of an inch and stopped. Encouraged, they pushed harder, but the wall section refused to budge any further. They stopped after a couple of minutes to rest. Well, that was fun, said James. I don't think I've done that workout before. Call it an exercise in futility, remarked Heather. Casey stepped back. Do you think it's supposed to open the door the other way? He asked. I mean, maybe we're pushing, but the sign says pull. I didn't see any sign, said Heather. And how are we supposed to pull when there's nothing to grab hold of? Except, said James thoughtfully, and he looked into the jaguar's mouth and then the small opening in the star. He inserted the fingers of his left hand into the jaguar's mouth and his right fingers into the star, like pocket holds on a climbing wall. Crimping his fingers, he pulled out. More mortar broke away from the edges of the door frame. The right sides of the wall section moved outward several inches, and pieces of broken stone exposed a rounded edge. James released his finger holds and stepped away to catch his breath. Heather moved a step back. I knew you had impressive rock climbing skills, but your rock pulling is equally remarkable. I think it'll come out more. I just need to reposition myself. James looked at his left hand, where some of the skin was roughened from his stone. The vandal sure did a number on the jaguar's mouth. It almost looks like my fingers have been chewed on. Heather poked her flashlight through the right side of the stone door. About 4 inches from the front edge, it looked like a stone router had smoothly cut a beveled edge that angled back. Looks like a small ledge, maybe a door handle on this side. Now that we have an idea of which way it goes, James, you two try to help from the open side. Heather and Casey grabbed the edge to pull. Pull on 3, said James. 1, 2, 3. The door resisted for a moment. Then, as if a catch had snapped free, the door swung open to the left and they stumbled backwards. On the back side of the door, opposite the star, James's crystal sparkled in the light beams. Guess the door needed some light oil, said Casey as James retrieved his crystal. Beyond the stone door, their flashlights pierced the narrow, low-ceiling blackness and reflected off dust floating in the air. On the hinge side of the stone door, two leaf spring-like contraptions struggled to hold the door open. Shiny flecks of metal revealed fresh breaks in the mechanism. James's light glinted on the springs. Well, now we know why it was so easy to open, at least after breaking through the cement. Casey's nose wrinkled. Smells like it hasn't been opened in centuries. Probably hasn't, said Heather. Maybe it's time to go back to camp and let Professor know. But do we really know it's worth checking out? Is it worth taking resources from the other dig site? James asked. There might be nothing back there. We're here, so we should at least see what's there. And you know the professor will want more pictures for proof. I'm not sure, cautioned Heather. If those springs fail and the door closes, I don't think we can open it. In that case, we'll just find the emergency exit, said Casey. What if this is the emergency exit, said Heather. James waved away the warning and entered the narrowed passage, followed by Casey. Heather shook her head and followed after the brothers. 20 feet later, they entered into an undisturbed chamber. On the wall across from the passage, dust-covered ceremonial staffs and spears leaned into the corners. Swords and other armaments lay on stone shelves that were built into the wall. A long stone box lay against both left and right walls. A variety of urns sat on top of each box, some with clay lids, others open, and a few were sealed with a yellowish wax. 2 levels of built-in shelves lined the right wall, each holding an assortment of daggers, knives, and ceremonial jars. A painted mural covered the left wall. Heather's left hand stifled a gasp as her light illuminated skeletal remains on the floor near the right box. The dried skin looked like it was shrink-wrapped onto the skull and bones. Empty eye sockets stared up. The lower jawbone hung open as if frozen in a final gasp for air. The remains of a small earthen jar lay nearby, a gray-white powder spilling out of the pieces. Casey's flashlight hovered over the remains. Looks like a botched robbery. James squatted near the broken jar. Or maybe that jar had some kind of poison or embalming stuff in it that killed this guy, and then sped up the drying process. That's probable, Heather added. He could be one set to guard this place, and if those boxes are sarcophagi, he'd also be here to protect whoever might be in them. I think it's time to get some documentation and get back to camp. She brought her camera up to her face. Picture, she warned. For an instant, the stone chamber was brightly illuminated. A spark on the left wall caught Casey's eye. While blinking away the spots from his eyes, he aimed his light at the wall. Another camouflage, and this time Casey saw the source of the sparkle. Similar to the painting in the previous room, this mural depicted a jungle scene. The difference was this mural was undisturbed. The treed landscape had 3 native homes which resembled grass huts in the foreground. The sun was high on the left side of the sky, the moon was low in the center. High on the right, a stylized falling star was depicted with elongated triangles pointing outward like 8 directions of a compass. Rainbow streaks stretched from the star upward to the right corner. The twinkle of light had come from the falling star's center. Heather and James watched Casey's light pan across the mural. Casey moved to the far end of the stone box to get a closer look. A circular crystal in the star's center refracted flecks of light around the room. Casey reached up to touch this crystal, and it moved slightly. He pinched it between his fingers and gently pulled. "No, wait!" shouted Heather. The crystal popped out effortlessly. Casey was startled, partly from Heather's shout and also because he had not expected the crystal to come out. At first it felt cool in his hand and then quickly warmed. He held the wafer-thin, 1-inch diameter crystal up close to his face. In the wall it had looked clear, but in his hands it was more silver. James leaned in closer. "Looks like mine. Try rubbing it." Casey rubbed the crystal briskly for a few seconds and held it up. The added heat revealed a faint 16-pointed star. Along the edge, several faint glyphs began to slowly appear. "Question for you two," said Heather. "How'd you figure out the rubbing thing?" James smiled. "By accident. James forgot his necklace by the pool. When I found it, it was hot, and I noticed some markings on it," added Casey. "Normally, body heat doesn't seem to affect it, so after the markings faded, we tried rubbing it to see if the extra warmth had similar effect." It seems this crystal is of the same material as yours, Heather said to James. She added to Casey, but you should have left it in place until its place was categorized. We need to get the team back here to get it documented before it gets more disturbed. A faint rumble reverberated through the floor, walls, and ceiling. The rumble transitioned to shaking. James' eyes darted around the room where some artifacts wobbled. Did you set off a booby trap? Pocketing the crystal, Casey replied. Feels like another tremor. We'd better take cover in case something falls on us, Heather suggested, just as the shaking stopped. Casey grinned. See? Just another small quake. It didn't even knock over any of the jars. Yeah, but there have been a lot of tremors lately, said James. A loud crack echoed from the passageway, and 3 flashlight beams shot toward the sound. The light pierced the short passage to the open door where the blackness of the antechamber was disappearing. The door's closing, shouted Heather, and she and James sprinted down the passage. Looking around the room, Casey stuffed a dagger into his belt and grabbed a couple of spears and short swords from the wall before racing to help. When Casey reached the closing door, James was desperately trying to push the heavy door open. Heather had barely squeezed through, but the opening was now too tight for either brother. She desperately tried to pull the door from her side. Casey jabbed one spear into the narrowing gap at the top. The stone crushed to a stop against the spear shaft. Glancing at the double leaf spring mechanisms, he saw one had snapped. The other was straining under the full weight of the door, flecks of metal popping off. Casey angled one short sword into the doorway, bracing it between the wall and stone door. He slid the second spear out of the opening and then grabbed the first spear's shaft to try prying the door open. Combined with James pushing and Heather pulling, the door opened a couple more inches. After shifting the spearhead, Casey opened his feet to shove the short sword down a few inches to further wedge open the door. Get through, James! Hesitant, James stopped pushing. When the door held its place, he squeezed through the opening while Heather helped him from the other side. Heather pointed to a nearby debris pile. Help me get some of those stones, she urged. We need something more to jam the door open. James grabbed a couple of large stones and placed them in the door's opening. None were large enough to keep the door open on their own. Snap! Ugh! Groaned Casey, and he fell back, holding the shaft of the spear. The obsidian spearhead fell to the floor, where it shattered into volcanic confetti. The sword wedge was starting to slip from its position, with the full weight of the door pressed against it. James grappled the door's edge, braced his feet against the wall, and pulled against the closing slab. The movement paused. Casey tossed his pack through the opening and started squeezing through. He grunted when the stone shifted. No, James, his face dark red with the strain. His feet pushed against the wall while he struggled to force the door back. Heather's wide eyes searched the dim room desperately. Seeing the spear on the floor, she grabbed and thrust it through the opening between Casey and James, levering the door open. The stone's movement paused momentarily, then jerked, snapped the spear shaft, and toppled Heather backwards. I'm through, gasped Casey as he pulled his legs clear. James released his horizontal squat and fell onto his brother. Another loud crack reverberated through the door slab, and the stones James had placed began to retreat from their futile efforts to hold the heavy door open. Between the doorway and massive stone door, the angle's short sword cowered, bent from the encroaching stone, and then slid back into the black passage. In a few seconds, only the odd pile of small rocks next to the wall hinted at anything unusual. James slowly stood. You guys okay? Yes, barely, breathed Casey from the floor. I know I could lose a few pounds, but I didn't need to get that skinny. Heather punched Casey on the shoulder. Don't do that again. Casey rubbed his shoulder and grinned. I think it's time to take Heather's advice and get back to camp to report our findings. They picked up their gear and headed back to the opening. Heather quickly wormed up the hole with the aid of the rope. Hurry up! I feel like I'm still shaking all over, Heather called down. Inside, dust started falling from the ceiling. I think there's another tremor, said Casey. I know we're supposed to stop, drop, and hang on, but I'd rather be on the surface. Rocks and debris began cascading down the hole as Casey and James scurried up. When James reached the top, a seismic ground wave knocked them off balance, and the shaking intensified. They scooted away from the hole as the sides began to crumble and fall in. Several large rocks broke free and tumbled down the earthen mouth, only to be stuck in the throat. Dust and dirt swirled and billowed, and the hole seemed to cough with an onslaught of debris. After nearly a minute, the rumbling stopped, and the one-time hole looked more like a shallow pit. I don't know about you two, but I think I've had enough close calls for the day, said Casey. James half smiled and laughed. You should see your faces. You two are filthy. One corner of Heather's mouth lifted in a smile. But at least I don't look and smell as bad as you. Her eyes narrowed at Casey. There's a reason you don't take things from archaeological sites. She sighed at the pyramid, frowning. I wonder how much was damaged. And if we can get back inside, that mural was amazing. You two may not know it, but it's extremely rare to find metal swords like what we saw down there. Many people still believe ancient Americans didn't have metal swords. You mean like this one? Casey grabbed a hilt protruding from his pack and pulled out the second short sword. Heather punched him in the upper arm. Don't you ever learn? What? We're out safe. Barely, especially you. James leaned towards his brother. Let me see that, he said, offering his hand. Casey handed the sword hilt to his brother, and I grabbed one of the daggers as well. He removed the dagger from his belt and showed it to Heather. Heather shook her head. You two and your fascination with swords and weapons. As I recall from our martial arts classes, it's not like you don't like them too, James teased. Heather smiled sheepishly. Casey placed the dagger into his pack, then pulled the crystal from his pocket. The waning daylight sent a rainbow through the crystal onto his hand. James glanced at his brother. Do you think that's the twin star? Casey nodded. Heather's head cocked at the brothers. She decided to be practical instead of asking her questions. We should head back before it gets dark. Maybe the professor can give us insight into that crystal. Maybe, James said doubtfully. Chapter 2.